This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And I'm really excited today because we are following up on our previous episode about some very creative personal secessions from the country that you're part of into an American version of the same maneuver, which I'm sure is not going to involve anyone being weird about Jews in any way whatsoever.
Yeah, so today we're talking about the sovereign citizen movement, and a couple of things to note before we even get into it. First, while the beliefs of the sovereigns are pretty wacky, and we're going to get into some of those, they're also not quite as funny as a guy just randomly deciding that he is the prince of the middle of nowhere in Australia, because it turns out the sovereign citizen movement has its roots in the neo-Nazi movement in the United States. And so it's a little bit of a downer in terms of the history. So just a heads up about that. The other thing to note is that this is going to be a two-part episode, simply because first, the history of how you get from weird neo-Nazis to what sovereign citizens are today is pretty complicated. That's going to be a lot of today's episode, is kind of working through the history of how this ideology evolves, really starting in the late 60s, early 70s. And second of all, it's just really convoluted because there is no kind of consistent sovereign citizen ideology. The way to think of it is more a series of conspiracy theories that grow out of a very specific moment in American history, and which then really can be grafted onto any other ideology that you happen to hold. So, for example, despite the fact that, again, sovereign citizens as an ideology grow out of white nationalism, there are black nationalist sovereign citizens that exist today, which we're going to talk more about next week. So, with all that said, I'm going to turn first and foremost to defining what we're even talking about, because, some of you might be normal people who don't know what we mean when we say someone is a sovereign citizen.
Yes, what an interesting term in the United States, a country that does not generally use the word sovereign to refer to anything legally on account of the very principles it was founded on.
Yeah, it's a kind of wacky idea, to put it lightly. So I'm going to rely on a definition from the UNC School of Government, which put out a great little primer called A Quick Guide to Sovereign Citizens. This is their definition of what a sovereign citizen is. There are two classes of citizens within the United States, according to a sovereign citizen. One class is sovereign or de jure citizens or original citizens of the states. The second class, first created by the 14th Amendment, is federal or U.S. citizens. Sovereign citizens enjoy all the rights of the Constitution, but federal citizens do not. Federal citizens, the sovereigns believe, have bargained away their freedoms by accepting the benefits from the United States government. Much of what sovereigns do is intended to rescind or denounce that federal citizenship and reclaim their common law sovereign citizen status with all its rights. This helps explain why they refuse to get driver's licenses or register vehicles, reject Social Security, avoid using zip codes, may not pay taxes, because those are all forms of contracting with the U.S. government and accepting the lesser class of federal citizenship.
So they believe that they are still part of a legal system, the common law system, but they are not, I guess they're not acknowledging anything after America became a country. Do they still think they're British citizens?
Well, not after America became a country. They're very into the colonial period and the first couple of decades of American history. But then something changed, Demetria, and in particular, a certain group of people started being allowed to be citizens in a more kind of systemic way who previously weren't.
Goodness me. Was a little war between the states possibly involved in this sudden shift in attitudes?
Yeah, you'll notice there's this kind of obsession with the 14th Amendment. That definition mentions the 14th Amendment is what creates the lesser citizenship, the federal or U.S. citizenship. So, As we all remember from American high school history class, especially those of us who didn't grow up in the United States, the 14th Amendment is one of the Reconstruction Amendments passed right after the Civil War, right after the war between the Union and the Confederacy. The very first article of the 14th Amendment is the one that says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So, for example, you might remember this is the reason why Seamus Kudirka, from a few weeks ago, right? He was an American citizen because his mom had been born in the United States and thus been given U.S. citizenship automatically because of the 14th Amendment. Sovereign citizens really tend not to like the 14th Amendment. Many of them believe that it is where this class of lesser citizenship comes from. We're going to see that grows really out of the kind of neo-Nazi roots of the 14th Amendment, and in particular, the idea that the law can't really make black people equal to white people.
Okay, I have to stop and ask here, because while a lot of black people in early America were legally classed as slaves, that was a legal class. It was not a status that applied to all people with black skin. There were free black Americans from the very beginning. How do they work that one into the ideology?
My understanding is it's really for the neo-Nazis, it's a concern about Reconstruction specifically. And then the conspiracy theory about Reconstruction not really granting the same level of citizenship, the 14th Amendment not really making these people equal citizens, gets grafted onto this wider sort of sovereign citizen ideology as it kind of metastasizes out of the neo-Nazi kind of worldview and into the kind of broader conspiracy muck, right, that just sort of floats about in American culture. And also, while we're on the subject of the 14th Amendment, I do also want to quickly note Article 3 of the 14th Amendment bans anyone from holding office, quote, who having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. So, that's another reason why certain people, particularly today, don't like the 14th Amendment very much. But that's a whole other potential episode. Anyway, the whole original point of the 14th Amendment, right, is to make freed slaves into U.S. citizens by ruling that since they're all born in the U.S., they're all U.S. citizens. And again, the kind of obsession with it grows out of the white supremacist roots we're going to look at in a second. I do also want to note, because this is kind of important from the jump, that sovereign citizens are weirdly obsessed with the gold standard. And we're going to look a bit about why that is too. But I guess we also have to quickly talk about the gold standard because of that.
Okay, I do have to ask. They keep talking about how the federal citizens are lesser. Do these guys just really hate Alexander Hamilton in particular?
I mean, a lot of them are kind of states' rights type, and he was very much not one. So I would assume they're not huge fans.
Yeah, is that because was Alexander Hamilton the non-gold
Federalist
guy? Yeah,
he was the Federalist.
So, yeah, just sort of blanket not Hamilton fans, huh?
I do not think they would have watched the musical for a few different reasons.
Oh, do you think the musical's Obama era pro-immigrant underpinnings are maybe not the kind of thing that neo-Nazis love?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. But Dimitri, you're distracting us from the gold standard. We have to talk about the gold standard.
Okay. All right. Talk to me about the gold standard, the only standard currency should ever be based on, because gold is a metal that never changes in value whatsoever.
Yeah, so if you don't know what the gold standard is, I mean, first of all, congratulations. That's really probably a good thing. For most of human history, this was the way currency tended to operate, where currency has a set value relative to gold. So, for example, the US government would say $300 is worth 1 ounce of gold, just as a random number. By definition, a US dollar is then worth 1/300th of an ounce of gold. So this is a way of kind of ensuring the value of currency because you always can kind of convert that currency into gold, and gold theoretically carries its value better than a currency that can be attached to a government that might go under or experience financial trouble.
Is this a holdover from the period where coins would literally have been made out of gold? Because that is a period in which the weight of the coin actually determines its value.
This is
And
my
that was why
understanding.
things,
Yes.
yeah, that was why things like coin clipping could even be a capital offense because you are devaluing currency.
Yes. And so the idea is to ensure the value of currency first by literally making it from precious metal, and then kind of through this exchange program where theoretically you can feel confident in the value of your dollar because you can exchange it for gold. But there are big problems with the gold standard. The biggest one is it puts a pretty hard cap on the size of a nation's economy based on the amount of gold it has, because the currency has to be convertible. It also increases the likelihood of bank crises if the bank doesn't have enough gold in reserve to cover all its commitments.
It also gives way too much power to those filthy Spaniards who are importing way too much gold from the New World.
We're really going back into history here, huh? So America, hopefully we all know, is not on the gold standard anymore. We've went on and off of it a couple times, but finally, noted communist Richard Nixon took America off of the gold standard in 1971 to pay for the Vietnam War. And we have not been on it ever since, because it turns out the real value of the US dollar is just that our economy is so insanely huge compared to everyone else's that our currency just carries value regardless. And also, there are other reasons that are more economically complicated why it's better to not be on the gold standard. And if you're a gold standard crazy person, I don't want to hear. Please don't send me a 10,000 character email about why I'm wrong and the gold standard's great. I truly do not care. Anyway, why does this matter for sovereign citizens? Because a lot of them are convinced that with the currency, the US dollar no longer being pegged to gold, it must get value from somewhere else, which is true. In reality, it gets its value from the social contract. We believe dollars have value. People accept them as money, and therefore they just have value, right? It is a socially constructed value because everyone takes the dollar. But that's too abstract for a lot of these people who instead believe that when the federal government abandoned the gold standard for the first time in the 30s, it substituted its own citizens as collateral for America's debts by pledging each citizen's future earnings to foreign investors of an unknown and shady background who would then cover America's costs.
Foreign investors of an unknown and shady background
Yes,
in the 1930s, you say?
Very clear who the foreign investors are supposed to be. It's the Jews. Again, it's anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. We're going to get more into this in a moment. But as a result, a lot of sovereign citizens are under the impression that, God, I don't even know how to say this with a straight face, that a secret United States Treasury account exists for every citizen of the United States, with a large sum of money either placed in it or pledged to it. The most common value for that is $630,000, but it can be up to millions of dollars. And as a consequence, two separate identities for every citizen of America exist. There's the corporate shell account that is attached to this treasury account, which is a kind of corporatized entity that sovereign citizens call a straw man, that is distinct and separate from their flesh and blood identity, their selves.
So where did these hundreds of thousands of dollars come from? From my tax dollars?
It's a little bit unclear. I don't know if the notion is that the federal government is taking out a loan in your name and just getting the money that way. To be honest, I spent more time than I care to admit trying to decipher how all of these pieces fit together. And most of them, as far as I can tell, are just trust me, bro, this is how it works, but in fancy legal language. And I don't really want to dig deeper than that. Because I value my sanity. Anyway, so that's the sovereign citizen ideology, that there are two classes of federal citizen, and also the federal government secretly has a bunch of money that it's taken out in your name that you can reclaim through legal mumbo jumbo. But how did we get there? how did we get to this being a thing that people believe? As I've already kind of spoiled for you, the origin of the term sovereign citizen actually lies with the American neo-Nazi movement, specifically something called the posse comitatus movement. So, let's talk about the posse comitatus, which is most associated with a guy named William or Bill Potter Gale, an American anti-Semite, and I would call him a neo-Nazi, though he would call himself something slightly different, who ironically is descended from Russian Jews who fled the Tsar in the 1880s. His ancestors actually came to the U.S. with future bugaboo of right-wing lunatics, HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which once upon a time helped evacuate Russian Jews from Imperial Russia, and now just helps people who want to immigrate to the United States. So, and a bunch of right-wing lunatics then associate it with the Great Replacement theory. And that, that organization is why William Potter Gale was, born in the U.S. His dad will convert from Judaism to Episcopalianism to try and get ahead in his career, first as a soldier, then as a cop. William Potter Gale is going to enlist at the age of 18. He's born in 1920 and ends up as a part of the staff of General Douglas MacArthur during the Second World War. He'll then leave the military after the war and become a minister and join a little something called the John Birch Society.
Uh-oh, I was going to ask, because this does not seem like the biography of a man who seems very likely to get seduced by Nazi ideology, but the John Birch Society, talk us through that one.
So if you have not heard of the Birchers, they are an anti-communist political movement from the early Cold War. They're named after this guy, John Birch, who supposedly was killed in a fight with some Chinese communists in a bar. It's a complicated story. And their kind of ideology is anti-communist. They, officially they say they're not a racist or anti-Semitic movement. They are right-wing enough that they tend to attract a certain type of people, and the Birchers tend to be kind of a gateway drug into the more extreme right, which is exactly what happens with William Potter Gale. He starts off as a Bircher, gets kicked out because by this point he has started to drift down the right-wing rabbit hole, and then gets involved in two movements that are really kind of the genesis of the sovereign citizen movement and the posse comitatus. The Christian identity movement and the tax protester movement. So we're going to start talking about Christian identity first. Have you heard of these guys? They're quite something.
I think this was actually not the particular kind of evangelical wacko that I was raised in. I was raised in the rhinestone-studded buckle of the Bible Belt with a different kind of Christian wackiness.
Yeah, Christian identity is more of a like West Coast, Midwest type of right-wing nut job. If you're not familiar with them, their core worldview is essentially that white people, specifically Anglo-Saxon Christians, are the actual descendants of the lost tribe of Israel, and they are the ones who kind of have the special covenant with God. And the Jews, meanwhile, are children of the devil, while non-white people are essentially lesser humans, sort of incomplete humans, as opposed to the pure Aryan white man created by God in the form of Adam. They're basically Christianity mixed with kind of extreme racism and anti-Semitism.
Okay, so they've come up with a very convenient reason why the whole love your neighbor thing doesn't really have to apply to any neighbors who happen to be a little swarthy.
Yes, it's love thy blonde and fair-skinned neighbor. So Gale gets involved in the identity movement, the Christian identity movement, out of Bircherism, and eventually falls in with a guy named Wesley Swift, who is the Southern California-based founder of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, which is the OG kind of Christian identitarian like church. Gale gets pretty high into the identity movement. He actually recruits Richard Butler to it. And if you haven't heard of him, Richard Butler is the future founder of Aryan Nations.
Oh, no, but also, can I just say really quickly, the idea of Jesus Christ Christian is really, really funny to me. I mean, the idea that Jesus Christ, the guy who is the foundational sort of figure of Christianity could have been religiously practicing Christianity, the religion that is founded upon his death and rebirth.
I don't think they've interrogated the theology of this in too complex of a way. I'm going to be real with you. I think they were a little too busy, and this is true, planning to assassinate civil rights leaders and founding something called the Christian Defense League, which is an armed Christian militia in California in the 60s.
Oh, yeah, that is obviously way higher priority than figuring out what the fuck is going on with your theology.
I mean, it's whatever is convenient to my personal racist beliefs is what is going on with their theology. So by 1965, Gale is living in Glendale, California. He's left the Church of Jesus Christ Christian and founded his own church. There's a bunch of splitting in this movement. And he starts publishing a church newsletter he calls Identity, the themes of which are ideas like Jews are actually not human, they're a different species, and did you know that Marxists have taken over the Christmas card industry? I don't know how they managed that. Karl Marx, not well known for his feeling of the Christmas spirit, but I guess anything's possible.
Well, Jews did write a lot of the best Christmas songs, so I don't know, man.
Haters gonna hate, I guess. But the biggest theme of Identity as a newsletter is that all federal civil rights legislation is unconstitutional because it's bad and says that black people are equal to me. That's the thing he's the most upset about. So, for example, an actual quote from Identity: when will a governor, all caps, of one of the states or the legislature, all caps, of one of the states protect the citizens of their state by repudiating, all caps, such unlawful acts of the federal legislature and other branches of government? He's talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1965 here. The federal legislation pertaining to the schools and area of education is without question unconstitutional, unlawful, illegal, and without legal effect. His kind of blatant racism starts to win him a small base, and he kind of uses that and the newspaper Identity, once he's kind of won over that base, to start he kind of issuing out his theories, what we call the posse comitatus movement. He outlines that for the first time in 1971, though he's kind of like flirted with it for about a decade or so earlier. So, what the fuck is a posse comitatus? We should probably talk about that.
Please define what I'm sure is completely grammatically correct Latin for me here.
Yeah, I think it might be, but only because he got it out of a textbook. So literally what that means in Latin is the power of the county. It's related to the old hue and cry in the English common law, the right under common law for civilians to essentially be deputized for law enforcement. And because this is common law, even though it's the law of England, it's kind of part of the collection of precedents that underlie American law, except in states where the whole posse notion has been explicitly barred by law. But for example, if you ever have heard of or if you ever seen a cowboy movie where the sheriff rounds up a posse, that's a shorthand for posse comitatus. He's tapping into that common law tradition of deputizing people. So the notion of the posse comitatus, as far as we know, goes back to the 1200s to a legal text called the Fleta. Specifically, I have a little quote here related to that. Sheriffs also frequently give a false answer in returning that they could not execute the king's command because of the power of some magnate who resisted them. And since such answers were down to the king's extreme dishonor, let sheriffs beware in future of making this return. But as soon as his underbailiffs notify him that they have encountered such resistance, let the sheriff at once put everything aside and, taking with him the posse of his county, the posse comitatus, execute the king's command personally.
Interesting. So this is really more of a way in a fairly decentralized policing system to get around basically all of the local lords saying, I do what I want. You can't enforce the law on my land.
Exactly. It's a way of getting around the power of the nobility by trying to deputize commoners in the name of the king to execute the laws of the land. The notion is expanded on in later legal commentaries in English history, during the Stuart period especially. It does appear in William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England in 1765. But by this point, there's not that much detail on it because after the 14th century, the posse power is not really used that much in English history. And that's because, especially in England, a lot of the sort of social disruption and riot is class-based, but it's not really the nobility increasingly that are making problems. It's the commoners who are rioting for things like, can we please have some rights? And so trying to deputize a posse of other commoners to go arrest some commoners is not really going to work. The people in that posse are probably the ones doing the rioting. And there's a similar issue in the United States when posse power is used. It's comparatively rare, actually, in a lot of American history. When you are dealing with civil unrest, farmers who refuse to pay taxes, strikers, those sort of people, state and local militias are kind of the same sorts of people. You don't really want to deputize them because they're much more likely to side with the strikers and rioters than they are with the government. Technically, in the UK, the Sheriff's Act of 1887 does still allow for posse comitatus. I don't imagine it's used that much. In the US, these days, the reason it tends to come up the most is because of what we call the Posse Comitatus Act, which is part of the end of Reconstruction, actually. It's a law that bans the military from engaging in police power. Since its members are definitionally not civilians, they cannot be part of the Posse Comitatus. Part of the compromises that are intended to end Reconstruction, basically. Like, this is something Southern states insist on, this law that prevents the military from engaging in policing, so that they can have a more free hand in the Southern states to impose Jim Crow. So, in America, the Posse Comitatus Act is good. It's basically the incarnation of that meme, the heartbreaking, the worst person you know made a good point. It is, the military should not be involved in policing, but the origin of this particular law is in allowing Southern dipshits to create Jim Crow, because the federal military can't stop them anymore. Anyway, that's the Posse Comitatus in terms of its history. For William Potter Gale, he starts talking about this term way back in 1958 when he tries to become governor of California. In a brief run under the right-wing Constitution Party. Fun fact, the day after he declares his candidacy, he goes on TV and says, my party is only for Christians, that the only way to pay the national debt is gold and silver, that the socialist income tax inspired by Karl Marx should be abolished, and that Zionists were all corrupted by Babylonians and had caused the communist revolution in Russia.
Wow, really long-term strategy by those Babylonians.
You can't trust him. It's those big hats and the beards. That's how you know. Shockingly, he does not even get the 50,000 signatures necessary to get his name onto the ballot for governor of California. So it's a very short run. But part of his campaign, he runs on the idea that Dwight Eisenhower needs to be impeached and arrested for violating the Posse Comitatus Act by a Posse Comitatus. Why does Eisenhower need to be arrested, Demetria?
Oh, it's going to be something real racist. I know it.
You're goddamn right it is. It's because he called out the army to help desegregate the schools of Little Rock, Arkansas.
So what this guy thinks the Posse Comitatus should be is basically legal lynchings, it sounds like.
Yeah, basically it's the white people have the right to enforce the law however they see it, regardless of the opinion of the federal government, which is run by the Jews.
Cool, dude. Okay.
Yeah. I also do want to quickly note that Dwight Eisenhower did have the legal authority to use the military to enforce desegregation. Section 253 of the Insurrection Act allows the Posse Comitatus Act to be suspended if states try to block the enforcement of federal law. So this is something that shitty right-wing people still harp on about, like, you shouldn't use the military to engage in desegregation, even if it's a good cause, you shouldn't do that. No. It says it in the law. Sorry. It was the right thing to do. Also, fuck those racists. I have opinions on this period of American history.
This guy seems like a real whack job, but he doesn't seem like a very popular whack job. So how does his How does his really out there message find its following?
He's not particularly popular, it's true. And part of the reason he's able to boost his popularity, really, once he starts kind of pushing his version of the posse comitatus, which, by the way, is pretty loosely outlined, we can talk more about it in a second, is because around this time he also gets really angry about his taxes. The tax protester movement in American history also has a long history going way back to 1909 when the 16th Amendment, which first allows for modern federal income taxes, gets passed. There's all sorts of batshit arguments from the tax protester movement. My favorite ones are we aren't on the gold standard anymore, so taxes aren't legal anymore. They were in 1909, but now that we're on the gold standard, it's not legal anymore. Another one commonly used by assholes is that taxation is a type of slavery, which is illegal under the 13th Amendment, and therefore I shouldn't pay taxes.
I just want to point out that these people who are arguing that because their money is a social construct, it's not real anymore,
are trying very hard to hang on to that money.
Yeah, they're trying very hard to hang on to their socially constructed money, even though they also believe the money's worthless.
So the tax protester movement also, this will shock you to know, has a bit of the same roots in weird right-wing white nationalism as that whole equating taxation with slavery argument might suggest. And as a result, the posse comitatus is able to kind of pull from that same well of followers. But there are a lot more people who are down with the notion of not paying their taxes than there are people who are willing to openly say, yes, I think only white people deserve like any consideration, and also the law doesn't apply to me. You know, there's a wider base that Gail can find in terms of sympathetic ears.
I have a question. I'm curious about something. So this tax protester movement, how did they start behaving in the 70s and particularly into the 80s? When the Republican Party started swinging very hard in a very dog whistly way about the welfare state. Is that refusal to pay taxes? Does that have anything to do with some of the racial undercurrent of what is going on in the sovereign citizen movement?
I would say yes, but by that point, the sovereign citizens have changed a lot in the 80s. We're not there yet.
Okay, sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah. It's really the 60s and 70s when the tax protester movement kind of starts to fuse with the posse comitatus. But at that point, I mean, sometimes there's dog whistles, sometimes there's not. For example, Gordon Kahl is a very famous tax protester in American history who's also a Christian identitarian. He's part of the same like racist movement as William Potter Gale is, and is convinced the IRS is a method for the synagogue of Satan to control the U.S. economy. Guess who that is? The synagogue of Satan.
Oh, boy.
And so guys like that, of course, are a pretty natural audience for Gale's whole sort of shtick. But there are also more just old-fashioned crazy tax protesters. Arthur Porth is a great example. Porth is a building contractor from Kansas who just decides in the 50s that taxes are not legal. And starts suing the government for a refund of his taxes using the whole 13th Amendment taxation as a form of slavery argument. This is not successful in federal court, shockingly, but he just keeps trying it. And also famously files a tax return in the 1960s that just says, I plead the Fifth Amendment. Basically saying that filling out your tax return is a form of self-incrimination, which he doesn't have to do because the Fifth Amendment bans being forced to incriminate yourself.
How does the IRS take that one? Because the IRS is one of those government agencies that one does not want to fuck with.
Well, in 1966, he's arrested for failure to withhold taxes from his employees' paychecks and not paying his own. So, not well. But Gale defends him, right? And so that wins him some sympathy among the like less racist wing of the tax protester movement, which is also like much bigger than the very racist wing, which is kind of confined to the sort of people who are not immediately going to be turned off by talking about how the IRS is controlled by the Jews. So because Gale is willing to kind of engage with those people and defend guys like Porth, he's able to sort of, find some sympathy among these people and start spreading his posse comitatus ideology. Again, that ideology is pretty loosely defined. The core argument is basically the federal government is doing stuff that's not legal. Why is it not legal? Because I don't like it and it helps people who are not white. And state governments are not stopping them from doing this. And therefore, at the local level, people should form their own posse comitatus, I guess would be the plural, to enforce the correct common law. There's only 27 lines of the initial article where Gale introduces this theory that actually outline what the theory is. The remaining 18 pages are just about things that William Potter Gale doesn't like that the federal government is doing, which are basically collecting taxes and caring about black people. He really does not like those two things. But yeah, the ideology is expanded on a bit in kind of future writings. So I'm going to quote from a future issue of Identity. In the formation of this constitutional republic, the county has always been and remains to this day the true seat of government for the citizens who are inhabitants thereof. The county sheriff is the only legal law enforcement officer in these United States of America.
No, okay, I have a question.
I'll do my best.
The First Amendment does protect a very broad range of speech. Very broad. But this doesn't actually seem like protected speech to me. This is starting to sound like incitement to commit a crime, and that crime might be insurrection.
So my understanding is that the incitement test in the US is very specific. You can't just be talking generally about insurrection. It has to be specifically like you should do this thing, which makes it very hard to prove legal responsibility. Our First Amendment protections in that way are a lot stronger than many other countries, which has its ups and downs.
I mean, he's really laying out a pretty specific list of actions, though.
He is indeed, but he's not specifically saying, this sheriff should try and overthrow the government. He's saying, I am of the opinion that broadly sheriffs could overthrow the government. And my understanding is that that's at least borderline.
Okay, all right. So as long as nobody acts on this,
well, if they do, they can be arrested. Yes.
Okay.
And also, he is very insistent that sheriffs actually are not responsible to the courts, which are part of the corrupted system. They are just enforcers of the law. And also that sheriffs you don't necessarily need a sheriff to raise a posse, which is not at all how common law works. It is specifically the power of the sheriff. He also suggests that sheriffs can impanel their own citizens' juries instead of courts doing so. Shockingly, there's not a lot of legal detail about how all of this is supported by precedent. I know that will astound all of you. There's a lot of graphic detail about how convicted criminals should be strung up and hanged, but not a lot on the kind of specifics of how this is actually supported by anything, astonishingly.
If I'm understanding this correctly, this guy who does not believe in the social construct of money does believe in the social construct of law, but he thinks that the law that is being enforced is actually not being enforced, and there's a different, secret, non-socially constructed law. So there's sort of a law standard in the same way that there's a gold standard.
Yeah, basically the law is common law for him, which is just, again, whatever he sort of like vibes-based thinks should be the law, based on his very racist vibe. So, yeah.
So how does that go? Because this is absolute legal nonsense, but it's very appealing legal nonsense to a certain kind of person.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because, there's not a lot of detail about how this is all actually legal, but what there is a lot of detail about? How, if you get 7, quote, Christian citizens, all of who, he does grammatically mistake that, must be residents of the county in which the posses, another error, is to be organized, you can send him an application with a filing fee, and he will grant you a charter from the United States Christian Posse Association.
I see. Oh, what an elaborate little scam he's got going
Yeah,
on. I
it's
was
basic.
actually really I was wondering all the whole thing about the secret amount of money that the government has that you can find some legal loophole to get.
That's a
I
later
have read
crazy.
about Oh yeah, I've read about quite a few scams using a very similar technique. So I was wondering when the money, the
Yeah.
socially constructed money, was going to start changing
We'll get to
hands.
the secret bank account thing. Right now, this is just him kind of conning people into getting a charter to form a posse. That's their natural right, so they don't need a charter for it. But also, you can get a shiny piece of paper.
So this is basically the equivalent of selling titles in your fake kingdom.
Yes. And Gale also around this time starts throwing around the language of these sovereign citizens that when you kind of form a posse and you reject the federal government, you are a sovereign citizen who is independent of the Jewish controlled federal government. He's the one who starts using that language. So William Potter Gale is going to remain a big influence on this movement until he gets arrested in 1987 for, shockingly enough, tax fraud and threatening government officials. He will die in prison in 1988.
Our money might be a social construct, but the IRS is very real.
Yeah, it takes a while for the wheels of IRS justice to grind, but they'll get you eventually. But his brand of kind of posse comitatus ideology is going to remain very influential on both the white nationalist movement and on kind of this growing anti-government radicalism. Because by the time that he dies, you'll also have something called the farm crisis in the United States. So in the 70s and 80s, there's a big agricultural downturn in the United States for a couple different reasons. A bunch of recessions in the 70s and early 80s, higher oil prices because of the oil embargo. Ironically, surplus, actually too much American wheat being produced that's driving down prices, and also decreases in the US export market when we embargo the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan. For all these reasons, there's a big agricultural crisis in the rural US, a lot of farmers falling into debt, having their land repossessed, obviously makes them a little bit unhappy with banks and government authority, and thus very ripe ground for guys like Gale or his adherents to then recruit them into this movement.
I was not expecting the price of wheat to come back into this. This has been a very wheat-centric few episodes.
Yeah, conspiracy theories seem to always come back to two things: the price of wheat and the Jews. You could probably draw some interesting connections there.
Well, I guess when you think about it, food stability is if you have any kind of food instability or price instability, you're going to get some extremely disgruntled people looking for someone to pin the blame on.
It's certainly that's exactly what happens, right? Gale kind of recognizes the farm movement is ripe ground for him, and works very hard to infiltrate it. To essentially, and I'm quoting author Daniel Levitas here, who wrote a great book on the posse comitatus, insert the DNA of its conspiracy theories and Christian identity philosophy into the cell of the farm movement, which became the carrier for it. So, for example, Gale has a political ally at KTTL, a radio station in Dodge City, that then he uses that radio station to popularize posse ideology, to say, like, are you upset that the government's repossessing your farm? Well, here's why. Elaborate white nationalist conspiracy theory, and here's what you can do about it. Form your own posse comitatus.
Oh boy. And I would imagine also because the American farming movement in particular was very disproportionately Protestant Christian, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The American Midwest is very Protestant Christian, so shockingly,
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, there was a very long movement deliberately to ship Protestant Christians out west to start farms.
Yeah. And the farm movement will start to kind of fall apart by the mid 80s, particularly in its most radical streak. In 1984, a farmer in Nebraska, Arthur Kirk, who's been radicalized by a sort of posse aligned group, the National Agricultural Press Association, who, fun fact, its founder is both a KKK and Aryan Nations member. He gets into a gun battle with police when they come to serve him papers for an overdue loan. And when he pulls a 41 caliber revolver and starts pointing to a sign that has all this posse comitatus rhetoric, saying police are barred from my home, you're not legitimate officials, all that stuff. When they try and come back with a warrant, he just starts talking about the international Jewish conspiracy and how all the cops are Mossad agents. And so he ends up dying in a gun battle, which is both galvanizing but also brings a lot of law enforcement attention onto the farm movement and the sort of associated posse comitatus Christian identitarian movement. Also, a bunch of really strong activism by groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which will eventually sue Aryan nations out of existence in Idaho in 2000, and other sort of organized groups that will try and really hard to kind of suppress the farm movement, the posse comitatus, and just this particular streak of radicalism.
And is this the same pressure cooker that is eventually going to give rise to really big incidents like Ruby Ridge and Waco?
Yes. Right. So the farm movement and all the associated movements start to fall off by the 80s, but the rhetoric, right, of posse comitatus, of the federal government not being legal, that's still floating around, and it gets picked up in the 90s by the militia movement, right, which is another big source of this kind of early sovereign citizen history, which is, again, very much a 90s phenomenon originally associated with the 92 Ruby Ridge standoff, which is potentially a future episode at some point. Randy Weaver, the guy who is leading that standoff, is a Christian identitarian. Part of the reason he fucks off to the middle of nowhere in Iowa is because he believes that America is controlled by the Zog. Have you heard of the Zog, Demetria?
Is that some weird kind of word for Jews?
It's the Zionist-occupied government that secretly controls America.
Oh boy. Wow, it's just Nazis all the way down, huh?
Pretty much, yeah. So the ideology of the militia movement is kind of hard to pin down. A lot of it is just this kind of suspicion of the federal government because of events like Ruby Ridge, which is this big standoff between this white separatist Weaver, Randy Weaver, and his family, and the FBI. Several members of Weaver's family are killed. And then the Waco standoff the next year, another potential future episode. As well as some new federal gun legislation like the Brady Handgun Act that just drives this kind of militia movement that is convinced the federal government's coming to take all their rights, that then picks up kind of this language of the posse comitatus. It's much harder, I think, to point to a foundational influence here. And that's because the militia movement is a lot more decentralized than the posse comitatus. I'm going to quote here from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Militia rhetoric invokes nostalgic, albeit usually historically inaccurate, imagery of the U.S. Revolution and founding, including praise for the Minutemen and the myth that only 3% of colonists fought for independence. Many believe the country is locked in a struggle between nationalists, themselves individuals dedicated to upholding original constitutional values, and globalists.
Womp womp.
Yeah, if you don't know, globalist is another code word, a dog whistle for Jews. Not everyone who says the globalists are out to get me is automatically a neo-Nazi, but they've clearly talked to someone who is, even if they don't realize it.
So there's something very interesting about this to me, because this is not a blend of neo-Nazi ideology that is wholesale jackboots and German uniforms. This is a group of people who are using a veneer of American patriotism and in a way don't even seem to realize where some of their ideology is coming from. So what's going on with that? Are they still talking to other neo-Nazi movements, or is this just completely a branch that is disconnected by this point?
I mean, I think that's hard to say, in part because, like, neo-Nazism... How do I put this? Okay, so we're getting into my personal interpretation here. Take it for what it's worth. So when we talk about, like, liberalism or Marxism, those are ideologies, right? Regardless of what you think about them, there is kind of a theoretical base for the belief system that you can then kind of interrogate. You can interrogate the theory, you can unpack it, you can say, I agree with this, I disagree with that, right? There's the kind of analytical side of it. Most forms of fascism, which I would call this all kind of a type of fascism, this sort of white nationalism, are not ideologies. They are largely feeling based. There's not like a theoretical core of fascism. The ideology doesn't make sense, right? Because it's a conspiracy theory that is premised on, we are the master race, but also we're constantly under threat, even though we are the greatest people ever to live on the face of the earth, right? The whole thing is contradictory. It is driven much more by emotion than it is by any sort of like actual intellectual worldview, right? So I think that's what makes it hard to pin down and define, right? That emotion, right? That sense of, things are not going the way I want to, and I want them to, and I'm angry about that. That is very appealing to people, particularly when things are going badly in the 80s. If you're worried about your farm being repossessed in the 90s, if you're worried about the federal government, coming in like Waco style and, attacking your family farm because they don't like what you're doing. Right? That sort of ideology is very appealing, right? It's not necessarily that all of these people sort of are neo-Nazis secretly, like they're all big fans of Hitler in that sort of way, though some of them are. Right? It's that they have this kind of emotional narrative of American history that appeals to them. That's very different from an emotional narrative of German history that would appeal to a member of the Nazi Party. Right? That sort of like jackboot, imagery is very much like it's a German imagery that appeals to a certain type of cultural nostalgia in Germany. I would argue American fascism looks very different. It's way more sort of cowboy inspired, colonially inspired, because of the kind of romantic narratives we have about American history.
Very interesting and a very civics teacher answer. Thank you.
I have spent a lot of time teaching the history of fascism and have a lot of opinions about it, as anyone who's listened to History of Japan knows. Amy Cooter, who is a sociologist who specializes in the militia movement, has a great metaphor that the connection across these groups is like having multiple trees in the same small plot of land. They're separate entities, but their roots grow in the same soil. I think that's a good way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So to get kind of more specific here, because I think we're talking very generally right now, let's talk about the Montana Freemen, who I think are a great example of posse ideology entwining with the militia movement in a way that starts to look more and more like the sovereign citizens we see today. So the Montana Freemen really crop up in 1996 in Montana, the year after the Oklahoma City bombing, but they have a longer history, led by a guy named Leroy Schweitzer, who is a former crop duster and real estate agent who went bankrupt in the 80s. His farm goes under and he gets involved with the farming movement and then organizes the Freemen. His movement doesn't recognize the federal government as legitimate. They're very big on this idea that they are American nationals and not 14th Amendment citizens. Their rights come directly from God, not from the federal government. So he's already kind of borrowing the language of the farming movement influenced by the Posse Comitatus. But he adds a fun new layer. He says, the federal government is controlled by the banking system. I'm going to destroy the banking system. The way he's going to do this is by writing a bunch of fake checks that his followers will try and cash. Good enough forgeries will allow him to steal money from the banks and eventually destroy them. And Schweitzer in the 90s has the help of a fun new tool that wasn't available when William Pottard Cale tried the same thing 15 years earlier: personal computers.
I was wondering, because you said that the ideology starts to get really fractured. I was like, is it because a certain World Wide Web is allowing all of these people to start their own forums?
Absolutely, right? Part of it is that, some of these people are on like the very early web, not even 1.0, the web 0.9, that, they're on these kind of Usenet forums or whatnot that are very lightly moderated and kind of spreading their ideology in small ways in the 90s, right? In the 90s, still internet access is comparatively rare. That's going to expand. But, for example, if you want to try and forge documents, like, for example, forging checks, it's also a lot easier with a PC than it is trying to do it like the old-fashioned way, right? Using, like, typewriters and kind of pulling up ink off of one document and transferring it to another, all that stuff.
Oh, yeah, you can plug in that inkjet printer and very, very slowly print yourself out a whole stack of personal checks.
Absolutely. So Schweitzer, he uses this system to attack the banks. He also does a lot of speaking tours, going around the country popularizing the idea that only the county government is legitimate. The federal apparatus is actually, he says, a corporation headed in Washington, D.C. that governs U.S. citizens. It doesn't govern organic sovereigns, which is what he is. The corporation thing, I think, is an outgrowth of the tax protester movement, but I couldn't really figure out where that comes from. You might remember the Reichsbürgers have the same thing about how Germany is actually a corporate government. I'm not really sure where that first kind of comes from, but this idea that governments are actually corporations becomes very central to this whole conspiracy theory. Schweitzer's also the one who starts to popularize this scheme where he asks for $300 donations, in return for which you will be part of a lawsuit against the federal government for unspecified damages that he's going to somehow file, and which will net him all $600 trillion of the American gold reserve. So I think this is where the notion of the secret account that you can tap into as part of this conspiracy theory, I think this is where that comes from.
This is so funny. I am actually currently researching a case that is exactly the same kind of scam, but a different secret amount of a different secret fortune. This is a really, really popular scam. I totally am going to get access to this money that's sitting in a bank somewhere. If you pay me, you can get a portion of it. This is a really old scam. So he's really hitting all the classics here.
I wonder if that's where he got it from, right? That this is kind of an older con and he just comes around to the notion of fitting it into this sovereign ideology about how the federal government's out to get you, but you can get them back.
Yeah, it used to be much more common to run this scam by saying that there was some aristocrats' fortune sitting in the Bank of England, and especially in the 1800s when people had no way of checking any of that, it could sound very convincing.
Well, hopefully the one you're going to talk about has less racism, because Schweitzer is also still very much a believer in kind of Christian identity, kind of pulled from the posse movement. He calls his followers the lost sheep, the select, the elect, the peculiar treasure, the royal priesthood, the Aryan, the battle axe.
So he is just coming right out and saying it, huh?
Pretty much. I mean, I don't want to disparage the people of Montana. I know there are parts of Montana that are not like that. There also are parts that are. And a part of this is also the idea, he's really leaning into this idea of common law that is kind of connected to the Constitution, but is also the Bible. One of his followers will say the common law is biblical law applied. So that's part of the justification for all this too, that right, we're really common law citizens, but also the Bible says that things should work this way, that we should all be sovereign citizens. I'm unclear on where in the Bible he pulled that from. But
I also thought that the common law system that America uses, I thought King Henry VIII had a couple of things to say about where biblical law comes into that one.
I think you're granting these people a level of scholarship that's not really accurate.
Okay, but I have to ask. This guy is straight up committing check fraud, and he's telling other people to commit check fraud. He's straight up just going around the country saying, hello, I'm committing check fraud, and you can too, which is an admission to a crime, and he is stealing from banks who presumably
and the law will get him eventually.
But I'm just amazed that it takes the law as long as it does.
I mean, to be fair, first of all, it's Montana. You want to go there? Like, really? And second of all, I mean, it is a little more complicated to track these things. I don't know how digitized banking is in the 90s. I would guess less so than today. So catching that sort of fraud does take a little bit longer, and it's potentially easier to get out of town before you get caught.
Oh, so was this sort of before the era of the kind of bank monopolies and conglomeration that we have today? Was he hitting smaller regional banks?
That's my understanding. There's a lot of bank centralization that happens after the 2008 financial crisis in America. This is obviously before that. And those smaller banks don't always have the resources to do the kind of thorough vetting you would need to catch a guy like this.
Man, this podcast has given me some knowledge of very specific things.
So the Montana Freemen, they first start coming to major attention in 1994. One of their members, a guy named Richard Clark, has had his property seized and auctioned because he hasn't repaid a bank loan and also has not paid alimony to his divorced wife. And so 28 Freemen take over the Garfield County Courthouse, including Clark, with weapons. They then take over the courtroom and form their own Supreme Court of Garfield County / Comitatus. Clark directs the whole thing. He fines the county judge in contempt of court for failing to be there as a witness to this whole process and issues a bunch of rulings. It's covered by the Montana press. By 1995, the group is targeting the county attorney, Nick Murnian, with a tactic that sovereign citizens will become very famous for, putting fake liens on his property because he enforces illegal land seizures based on people not paying their loans.
Wait, back up. He took over the courthouse, like an armed takeover, and this is not what takes him down?
He just walked in with guns. He didn't hurt anybody. Right? And it's not clear to me whether he brandished the weapons or pointed them at someone. That's illegal in a lot of states, just walking in with them. I don't know Montana's law well enough to say whether it's illegal. People who were there describe it as like, they have the weapons, they say we're using the courthouse, but they're not like directly violent. There's no one ever says like, let us in or we'll shoot you.
So he just walked very confidently, and everyone in this courthouse was like, wow, this guy seems like he has the right to be in this courthouse.
I mean,
and he
there's 28 people counting him, and the courthouse staff is not big. It's maybe a dozen people tops. Like, he just walks in with numbers and guns, and people let him in.
I don't know if it's that post-Waco and Ruby Ridge hesitance to start another shootout, but it seems like this guy has committed plenty of crimes for which he could have been arrested.
Keep in mind here, too, right? This is small-town Montana. Everyone knows each other. I read a PhD dissertation on the Freemen while I was doing my research, and that's the kind of the theme that kept coming up is like everyone in this part of Montana knew all the people in this movement, right? Because there's not a lot of people there in general. And so it's not just like these are randos, like this is your neighbor. It's potentially your cousin or your brother, or whoever. Like, do you want to call in the feds and be like, maybe there's going to be another Waco?
Yeah, Montana in particular has a history with not particularly liking having the feds called in. Wow, okay, so this guy's just doing a little light crime and everyone's like, well, guess he's down at the courthouse doing some crime today.
Well, I mean, the county attorney, Nick Murnian, is trying to prosecute him prosecute the group for all the bank fraud and for, trying to block like these like legal, even if they're not great, land seizures that are happening because of unpaid loans. But the group has a way to deal with that too, through property liens. Right? There's not really, we're going to see this as a theme when we deal with sovereign citizens. All of their legal claims are nonsense, but the American court system doesn't have a great way of automatically dismissing cases that are based on nonsense. So any lien that you put into the system, right, this is like basically like a legal sort of hold on someone's property in case it needs to be seized, gets processed, and eventually it'll get hashed out in court and be determined to be fake. But there's no automatic way of saying, okay, this should be thrown out. It has to go through the process. So you just keep doing it over and over again. You can harass someone pretty effectively. Or you just keep filing paperwork saying this land seizure is illegal. The court has to kind of deal with the case, even if it's just dismissing it automatically. You can just keep doing it and basically like waste a bunch of time and energy and money, which is going to make people not want to bother you, because otherwise, they might wake up one day to find that they're being sued 100 times over, or there's 20 liens on their house.
Wow. Okay. So in a weird way, not for the reasons that he thinks, but he has actually fairly effectively created a posse.
I would say so. But eventually the feds do get involved, and that's when things change. When it's not just state and local law enforcement, the FBI starts looking into this fraudulent money stuff and then gets concerned that the Freemen are also stockpiling weapons. And so on March 25th, 1996, Leroy Schweitzer and two other members of the group are arrested by undercover FBI agents. But that leads to a new problem where the rest of the Freemen hunker down in a little township they've created, what they call Justice Township in Garfield County in Montana. And there is an armed standoff between the FBI and the remaining freemen that lasts for 81 days. Eventually, they are convinced to surrender, but for a while, it's looking like another Waco-style shootout might happen. There's a lot of concern there. But eventually, the group do surrender, and Clark will actually do 12 years in prison. Leroy Schweitzer will die in prison under his, with many, many convictions to his name. So the Freemen are eventually kind of crushed by that. But by this point, this sort of conspiratorial mix of belief the federal government isn't legitimate, with this kind of concern about banking and the gold standard and all of that, with this idea of local law being the only real law, is sort of out there. And as you already noted, you know what else is out there by 1996?
The internet.
The internet. And it really is what's going to start to metastasize and spread this ideology out of explicitly white nationalist circles, though, as we're going to see, weird conspiracism is part of all sovereign movements, and very often that conspiracism circles back around to the Jews. But it starts to kind of spread beyond the original roots into this more disconnected series of movements that are all, they're trees in the same soil, right, to use that great metaphor, but they're not directly branches of the posse comitatus.
All right. So is that where we're leaving it for this week?
That's where we're going to leave it for today. I think, in terms of just takeaways from this week, things I want you to remember before we talk more about the sovereign citizens next week, I think part of the reason this ideology, that Gale is able to find something that really spreads effectively is because, this type of conspiracism has a certain base appeal. I think it's very, very easy to offer people easy answers to difficult situations by saying, these problems actually have a simple solution and I can solve them for you. He really taps into that very effectively. I think it's also a great example of how conspiracism is sort of baked into the heart of American culture. There is a great book on this subject that I am forgetting the name of. Oh, damn it. I am completely drawing a blank.
We can put it in the show notes.
But this notion of kind of conspiracy, I think, is very central to, parts of American history. This idea of, right, the kind of will of the people kind of being under threat from this secret conspiracy, and the kind of European roots of a lot of especially elite culture in America means that conspiracy tends to tie very effectively back into white nationalism and eventually into anti-Semitism. This is something I think is very important when you are dealing with trying to combat both movements like the sovereign citizens, but also most virulent forms of the extreme right in the US. You have to understand the ways in which the worldview is animated by anti-Semitism. I would hope most people care about anti-Semitism purely based on their own decency. But even if that's not necessarily the case, you should care because that sort of conspiracism, which ties into anti-Semitism, is very effective at recruiting people into neo-Nazi and neo-Nazi adjacent spaces, which is bad. And so we should try and understand how that works to prevent it from happening. This is my soapbox.
All right, that was a great soapbox for you to be on, I think. I would be very concerned if anyone listening to this does not agree.
Yeah, that's probably the case. And in the meantime, we're going to leave it here, and we'll come back around to this in the future episode in 2 weeks' time and talk about the further growth of this movement. But in the meantime,
if anyone would like to buy our completely legitimate permits to form a posse, we are offering them 50% off, completely legitimate common law permit to just go nuts. You don't even need 7 Christians, just whoever's nearby, form a posse.
Yeah, you explicitly actually can't have 7 Christians in the posse.
Actually, yeah. If you are a group of 7 non-Christians, you can be a posse. If you pay me $50.
Yeah, and you'll just get the permit from Parks and Rec that just says, I do what I want.
Absolutely.
And you can get that. You actually can't get that, but you should go anyway to facingbackward.com, which is our website.
You can also find us on Patreon at patreon.com/facingbackward. And thank you to our generous patrons who are bound by no laws but the common law of God. You are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCullough, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Devon Freschka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Jacob Key, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Akuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonasia podcast, Jennifer Pianzo, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked.
Until next time, people, remember, there are no laws except the ones I guess you want to exist.
What do you think bar mitzvahs are like at the Synagogue of Satan?
I bet they're bangers, honestly.